In 1918, on November 11th, every gun on the Western Front fell silent. The Great War was over, and Britain had won. The Union Jack was flying over one of the greatest empires history had ever seen. A quarter of the world map was still under British control. In London, people were celebrating in Trafalgar Square, cheering victory. From the outside, everything seemed perfectly clear. Britain had won the war. Britain was powerful. Britain was still the center of the world. But inside the Treasury building, in the corridors of Whitehall, and in the rooms of the Bank of England, a very different reality was being discussed, because the Britain that had won the war was actually bankrupt. To fight this war, Britain had spent on a scale never seen before. To defeat Germany, it had expanded its armies, enlarged its fleets, and consumed enormous quantities of ammunition, steel, coal, ships, food, everything. And the cost was severe. The national wealth accumulated over centuries had melted away. Britain did not just collect taxes from its people. It also sold off the assets it already owned. Railway investments in Argentina, mining shares in Africa, capital holdings overseas. One by one, they were turned into cash, because it had to buy steel from America, wheat from Canada, and keep the war going. Then those reserves ran out too, and Britain borrowed. Before the war began, the national debt had been around £600 million. By the end of the war, it had soared to £7 billion, and a significant portion of that was owed to America. Worse still, this debt would not be repaid in sterling. It would have to be repaid in dollars. So the Britain that emerged from the trenches in 1919 was not the Britain that had entered the war in 1914. It had once been the world's creditor. Now it was a debtor. It had once dominated global trade. Now its rivals were capturing its markets. While British factories spent the war producing shells and weapons, Americans and Japanese were taking over textile, machinery, and trade markets elsewhere in the world. England's old industrial engine was now struggling. Coal, shipbuilding, steel, especially the heavy industries in northern England, Wales, and Scotland, had become more cumbersome, more expensive, and more outdated than their new competitors. Up to this point, everything was bad, but understandable. The real disaster began after that, because Britain's elites refused to accept the new reality. The politicians in Westminster, the bureaucrats in the Treasury, the bankers in the City of London, all of them saw the post-war economic shock not as a permanent change, but as a temporary deviation. In their eyes, the world had been shaken, yes. But now that the war was over, the natural order would return. And at the center of that natural order, London would once again stand. And for that, there was one single symbol: the gold standard. Before the war, the gold standard had been the backbone of the global financial system. The system was simple. Major currencies were fixed to a certain quantity of gold. In other words, paper money was not merely a promise from the state. In theory, it could be exchanged for gold. That is why sterling was not just an ordinary currency. Sterling meant trust. Sterling meant empire. Sterling meant the language of world trade. From Tokyo to Rio, loans were priced in sterling and trade flowed through London. Britain's power did not come only from its navy. It came from its currency. But when the war began, that system was suspended, because it was no longer possible for the state to operate under the limits imposed by gold. It had to print more money, it had to spend more, and the result? Inflation. During the war, prices in Britain more than doubled. The value of sterling fell, and the pound, which had been worth $4.86 before the war, fell to as low as $3.40 after it. Today that may sound like a technical detail, but to the leaders of that era it was almost a national humiliation. To them, a weak currency meant a weak state. The fall of sterling was seen not merely as an economic adjustment, but as a loss of British prestige. It was even treated almost like a moral failure. So Britain's elites fixated on one single goal: returning to the gold standard. But returning was not enough. They wanted to return at the old pre-war exchange rate. In other words, they wanted to fix sterling once again at $4.86. In other words, they wanted to turn back time, as if the war had never happened, as if the debts, inflation, industrial decline, and America's rise had never taken place. Behind this decision was not just economics, but psychology, pride, nostalgia, a refusal to accept that London had been overtaken by New York. The problem was that the world had changed. America was now the new center of global finance. It held most of the world's gold. And British industry was no longer competitive enough to support such a strong currency. Even so, the decision was made. And for that decision to be implemented, Britain would have to deliberately squeeze its own economy. Because if you want to strengthen sterling again, you have to bring down prices and wages at home. That means money would become scarce. Credit would become expensive. Spending would be cut. The economy would be suffocated. In short, Britain did not begin rebuilding itself. It began tightening itself. Today, we would put it like this: the country was trying to cosmetically improve its currency instead of actually improving its real economy. And the price would not be paid by bankers, but by working people. The Bank of England, especially its powerful governor Montagu Norman, defended a tight monetary policy. Interest rates were kept high. Credit was restricted. Government spending was cut. The aim was very clear: let the economy slow down, let prices fall, let wages fall, and let sterling grow strong again. On paper, it looked logical. In reality, it was like a country trying to grow stronger by starving itself. In the early 1920s, bankers in the City of London were pleased to see a stronger pound. But in the north, factories, shipyards, and mines were weakening. Because as sterling appreciated, British goods became more expensive for foreign buyers. For a French buyer, British steel became more expensive. For South America, British coal became more expensive. In other words, Britain took an already struggling industrial base and with its own hands made it even less competitive. Orders declined. Unemployment rose. First 1 million, then even more people were out of work. The homes fit for heroes promised to returning soldiers turned into despair in many regions. But the financial circles in London watched this pain with almost religious patience. In their view, this was temporary suffering, necessary medicine, painful but the right cure. Then, in 1924, a very important figure entered the stage: Winston Churchill. Today, most of us remember Churchill as the stubborn leader of the Second World War, the man who resisted Nazi Germany with his famous speeches. But in 1924, Churchill was not just a war hero. He had become Chancellor of the Exchequer, a politician who wanted to leave behind a great legacy in economics. And to be honest, economics was not his strong suit. By his own admission, when he looked at Treasury numbers, the figures swam before his eyes. Churchill was more interested in history, the idea of empire, and grand gestures. When he arrived at the Treasury, he was immediately surrounded by the financial authorities of the time, Bank of England officials, Treasury bureaucrats, city bankers. They all told him the same thing: "You will be the man who brings Britain back to gold. This will give you a historic legacy. This will restore Britain's honor." Churchill was not entirely convinced. Deep down, he had some doubts. He wondered what this policy would do to producers, merchants, and workers. In fact, in his private correspondence, he raised a question that sounded something like this: Why should the interests of finance take priority over the interests of industry? To resolve these doubts, Churchill brought together important figures. He invited both supporters of the gold standard and its harshest critic, John Maynard Keynes. Keynes was one of the brightest economists of the time, and he gave Churchill a very clear warning. He said, "The pre-war rate of 4.86 is no longer realistic. The world is changed. Sterling's natural level is lower now. If you artificially fix the pound back at 4.86, you will make Britain's currency about 10% overvalued." And that meant this: you would be imposing an invisible 10% tax on British exporters, because their goods would become more expensive for foreign buyers. And how would companies make up the difference? By cutting wages. So Keynes was really telling Churchill this: if you do this, you will be declaring war on the working class. This warning was very clear, very powerful, and history showed that he was right. But whose advice did Churchill ultimately follow? Not the economists, but the bankers, the traditionalists, the guardians of the status quo. And on April 28, 1925, Churchill stood up in the House of Commons and declared that Great Britain was returning to the gold standard at the pre-war exchange rate. The chamber erupted in applause. The city of London rejoiced. The newspapers presented it as an act of great statesmanship. Britain's elites in London thought chaos had ended and order had returned. But outside, real life responded far more quickly. The price of British coal in international markets rose at once. Buyers turned to Germany and Poland instead. British mine owners panicked. They were already operating on thin margins. Now, because of this new exchange rate, their profits were evaporating. Only one option remained: cut costs, and cost meant people. In the summer of 1925, mine owners announced that they were ending the National Wage Agreement. Miners' wages would be cut by 13 to 25%, and working hours would increase from 7 to 8 per day. The miners were furious. They were already the people working under the harshest conditions. Now they were being asked to work longer for less pay, all for the sake of financial prestige in London. The union's slogan was clear: not a penny off the pay, not a minute on the day. Keynes's warning had come true. The cost of returning to the gold standard had been placed directly on the backs of the people doing the hardest labor in the country. When the government saw that the crisis was deepening, it bought time with a temporary subsidy. But this was only a bandage. The real wound had not healed. And in 1926 the great explosion came. The mine owners did not back down. The miners did not give in. A lockout began. Then other unions joined in support. On May 3, 1926, one of the biggest industrial confrontations in British history began. The general strike. Buses stopped. Trains fell silent. Ports slowed down. Printing presses shut down. More than 1.7 million workers walked off their jobs. The country looked paralyzed. And at the center of this vast crisis stood something invisible, yet immensely powerful: the gold standard. In other words, a monetary regime that looked technical on paper was tearing apart the social fabric of an entire country. The government was prepared. Volunteers were brought in. Middle-class citizens, students, and former officers stepped in to keep the system running. Churchill, meanwhile, framed the strike in government propaganda, almost as a rebellion against the constitutional order. In the end, the Union leadership retreated. The general strike ended after 9 days. But the miners were left alone. They fought on for months. Their children went hungry. They sold their belongings. They tore apart their homes just to survive. But in the end, they were forced to return, with longer hours, with lower wages. London breathed a sigh of relief. The bankers and state elites thought they had won. But the bitter truth was this: the real victory never came. Because they crushed the strike, but they could not save the economy. Between 1926 and 1929, the world was moving in another direction. In America, the roaring 20s were underway. Industry was booming. Cars, radios, and skyscrapers were rising. Countries like France and Belgium were adjusting their currencies to realistic levels and recovering. Britain, meanwhile, was standing still, because the fundamental problem had not been solved. Sterling was still overvalued. British goods were still too expensive. Interest rates were still too high. Industry still could not access the cheap money it needed for investment. In other words, Britain was being suffocated at the very moment it needed to modernize. The old sectors continued to decay. Unemployment remained high. In some industrial towns, a large share of men were still jobless. And then came 1929. Wall Street crashed. The Great Depression began. Britain's already fragile economy became even weaker. Global trade collapsed. Credit dried up. Europe's banking system shook. London banks saw the loans they had extended to Germany coming under strain. Then investors noticed something. The Bank of England's gold reserves might not be enough to cover its obligations, and a run began. This time it was not a run on banks, but on the pound. People began converting their sterling into gold and foreign currencies. The government panicked. Bankers demanded austerity. Spending was cut. Even unemployment benefits were slashed. Public sector wages were reduced. So once again, society was asked to sacrifice in order to defend the currency. But at that point, the system itself began to crack. In the Royal Navy, wage cuts triggered anger. Sailors at Invergordon mutinied. This might seem like a small event, but the message it sent to financial markets was enormous. Britain might no longer be fully in control of its own system. That news increased the pressure on the pound even further. And in September 1931, Britain finally abandoned the gold standard. The pound would no longer be convertible into gold. It would float freely. The elites expected catastrophe. They feared the currency would collapse. They expected chaos. They thought London's end had come. But something interesting happened. Yes, the pound fell. But the world did not end. Milk deliveries continued, buses ran, shops stayed open, and more importantly, the economy began to breathe. A cheaper pound made British goods competitive again. Interest rates were lowered, credit expanded, the housing sector revived. New industries began to grow. In other words, after abandoning the gold standard, Britain moved not toward disaster, but toward recovery. And here lies the most painful part of the story. Because that was when everyone realized this. A large part of the suffering endured in the 1920s had been unnecessary. The unemployment, the strikes, the poverty, the social tension. Much of it was not the result of some unavoidable external fate, but of bad decisions made at home. Germany had not bombed the British economy. Britain's own obsessions had suffocated it, for the sake of prestige, for the sake of returning to the past, because it put the symbol ahead of real production. This story teaches us a very simple but very important lesson. A currency should serve the economy. The economy should not serve the currency. When a country sacrifices the welfare of its people for the sake of a symbol that only appears strong, it is actually destroying its own strength. Britain remained a great power for a while longer, yes, but its financial backbone had been broken. Its industrial base had weakened, and when a new threat began rising in Europe a few years later, it no longer possessed that old financial confidence. That is why this story is not just the story of the gold standard. It is the story of how an empire shot itself in the foot because of misguided pride. It is the story of what happens when financial symbols become more important than real human lives, and perhaps most importantly, it is the story of how not only malicious decisions but also well-intentioned decisions detached from reality can inflict enormous damage on a country. Churchill, Montagu Norman, and the other leaders of that era did not see themselves as traitors. On the contrary, they believed they were patriots. They thought they were protecting the nation's honor. But in economics, this is often where the greatest mistake is made. You mistake the map for the terrain itself. You place the symbol above reality. You make the value of money more important than the value of people. And in the end, you lose both. That is what Britain did in the 1920s. It wanted a strong pound, but it created a weak economy. It wanted financial credibility, but it lost social peace. It wanted to preserve the glory of the past, but it weakened its future. And that is why Britain's return to the gold standard was not merely a bad monetary policy. It was an empire denying its own reality. If this video gave you a new perspective, subscribe to the channel. To rule the future, you must understand the past. See you in the next episode.